Good afternoon, everybody. That was the voice from above. Okay, good. Thank you so much. Welcome for joining us at the very last time slot of today. It's been a long day already, and so we're really, really chuffed and happy to see so many of you here today. Thank you so much for joining us for our second session this conference, and this one's Advanced Analytics at Scale. Our other session was a sort of introduction to advanced analytics, and in this one we really want to talk about extending that functionality to server and adopting that to a wider organization, to the wider organization. Now, just as the other session, we just start off with that little blurb that's on the website and in the app, and hopefully you will have seen it, but we always use it to sort of to give you a layout of today's session. So today's session will all be about how we can bring data scientists together with business users. Now, hopefully, the room will be filled by both of these groups today. And we want you to look out for different things, right? If you're a data scientist, we really want you to look out for those things and those features in Tableau that you can leverage to bring your hard craft to a wider audience. And if you're here today as a business user, we really want you to see the art of the possible and the things that your data science team can add to the organization. Now, the rest of the session will, of course, also focus on how we can scale that across the organization and bring that value to more and more people to bring more insights, and there, of course, an iterative process bringing on more and more value. Now, today's session has been listed as a Jedi session because those session levels are set across the entire TC, and we do, of course, assume some working knowledge when it comes to a little bit R and Python and the external services connection and advanced analytics in Tableau. I really want to talk about how you can then optimize that for wider deployments. Some household remarks. As always, all sessions are recorded, so take all the notes and pictures and photos and anything else you want, take all of them. But if you just want to sit back and relax, feel free to do so as well. The recording and the slides will be available to you afterwards. And we do have quite a bit of content to go through, so we'll make sure that there's time at the end for questions, but until then, we do ask you to hold them.
Before we go ahead with anything further, I just have a question for the room. How many of you are currently using Tableau in conjunction with an external service connection, so something like R, Python, or MATLAB? Just by show of hands. I see a few hands cropping up all over the place. Not everybody by any stretch of the imagination, maybe not even half. And I would say that, judging by our experience, this is broadly indicative of what it is that we see within a lot of our customer base, that there's a lot of interest, but not always a lot of people putting this into practice right now. And I think that's really what we're going to be trying to really impress upon you in terms of how you can get to that next phase of really starting to use this within your organization. So the first thing that we're going to cover is how the current situation that we now see is currently surveyed. We're then going to give you a sketch of where it is that you can go so that you can understand how you can bridge that gap. What we're going to be talking through today is really an implementation framework, a way for you to understand how to break down a particular problem or situation and try to make it relevant for applying the things that we're going to be looking through today. Once you've identified how these things can be implemented, they're only really useful if they can be then scaled across your organization. So that success that you might have identified isn't just isolated within a single team, a single department, a single business unit, but can really work across a wider organization. We're going to have a bit of a Q&A session here during the course of the session, and then we're going to summarize, have a few ending remarks, and also point you towards further resources where you can continue this journey after. But I think that we haven't even really introduced ourselves here, have we, Irvin?
No, we always do that way too late. For those of you who haven't seen the presentation by us before, my name is Aaron Verlaar. I am the team lead for our actually quite amazing group of product consultants from our Tableau's London office, covering the Benelux, Nordics, Middle Eastern, and Africa region. My background's in public health. Worked as an occupational health manager for a few years back in Holland, where I'm from. And it wasn't until I actually started working with Tableau as a customer that I really started to see the power of analytics. It actually made me move to London and work for Tableau, where I've been for almost 2 years now.
My name is Eric Polano. I'm an associate solution architect at Tableau. Somewhat different background from Irvin, despite the fact that we've been doing relatively similar things during our time here together. My background was within applied econometrics, so I was looking a lot at, for instance, how you can use experiments within labor economics to understand different biases that people have within decision making. I worked for a while at a different vendor that is sort of named here, but I won't say the name of. But I'd say that outside of Tableau, I spend probably an unhealthy amount of time. And some of you who might have seen me here at the conference before might know a little bit around my obsession with smart home automation. So I've been installing different smart devices like light bulbs, different electrical water cookers all over the place that I've now synchronized with different motion detectors. I think that it's fair to say that I'm now in a situation where I'm looking for a new flatmate. I hope that they'll be able to have some form of recuperation from some of these more obscure things that I want to do in my spare time.
Yes, and already looking around the room, there's a lot of you worried about Eric's social well-being and his social status. So as a team, we really do work together, and we do our best to get him out sometimes as well, which is all fun and games until he once again starts talking about his home automation. And then things change quite rapidly.
But, you know, I'm still accepted, I think, at least here.
We tolerate him, I think is the official word. Hopefully you've seen a little bit by our background that we sort of represent these two groups that we're talking about in today's session. My background is truly in business. I was always sort of highly engaged with the context and my business value with a high focus on output and how good my business was doing.
Whilst I might be more representative of that different group of user who might be coming at certain situations with that sort of framework of a statistician or a data scientist, I might look at certain things and try to understand, can I apply this model here in this way to make it sure that it's valid in terms of the statistical framework that I'm working with, and therefore be very concerned with the validity without necessarily always knowing the day-to-day of that business user.
And that's what we're going to be talking about today. But before we do so, messed it up there. Well, doing these things live, it's insane. Anyway, we're still going to do it. To make sure that everyone's on the same page here, regardless of whether you're a business user or a data scientist, we just thought very basic, we know, but just making sure that all our noses are pointed in the same direction, that we're all on the same page. And it's just, once again, very basic, but it's sort of the difference between correlation and causation. And we're going to be talking very briefly about that because we're going to be talking through a use case throughout this presentation. Now, correlation just means that two objects are following an identical path. But it doesn't mean that object X and Y are actually interfering or influencing each other's paths and trajectory. So if I were to ask you, if you were willing to make a business decision based off of two variables that have a correlation of 99.26%, which is higher than my eyesight. It's higher than any score I've ever had at school. But just by show of hands, how many people would feel comfortable with that? The score is actually someone very good. I mean, the score is probably also a little bit around the same percentage of the probability that you guys think this is a trick question, right? Yeah, all right.
So let's go for the big reveal of what this really is. Now, it's of course sort of possible that these two things are causally related, right? That there's something about consuming margarine that does really bad things for your marriage, especially if you're in Maine. Like,
or it's just the origin, of course, the milkman stereotype. You might not know.
At least in Maine, at least in Maine.
It's late on the day, guys, it's late in the day.
But if we take a bit of common sense surrounding this, and you think about the total number of time series that are out there in the world that we could put on a chart like this, the chances of us finding different types of time series that are just randomly correlated with each other is, of course, pretty high. And we wouldn't necessarily know that without that degree of common sense to be able to evaluate that. So maybe we need to figure out different instances where maybe we need to understand when we can tease out causality in business situations and with different organizational challenges. Now, when it comes to how we tease out causality in the real world, the ideal would be to run a double-blind controlled experiment, right? You would have one group that you would be able to expose to a treatment. You'd have another randomized set of subjects that you would then be able to allocate to a placebo. You would observe the difference between these two, and then you'd be able to make your decision. Alternatively, you maybe run through a particular business decision or organizational change. You see what the impact is. You get into a time machine. You then run through the same time sequence without that particular intervention, and you see what happens. Now, most finance departments aren't particularly happy to just throw out budget for running experiments willy-nilly, right? And time machines don't really exist as far as I know. So we need to find certain ways how we can approximate these things in instances where we might not have access to experimental data. Now, one really novel approach that we can maybe look at is, for instance, stuff like the causal impact package written by the Google data science team. Now, causal impact tries to tease out, for instance, how we could have a counterfactual forecast. So what do I mean by this? Let's say that we have certain input variables that we can use to predict an outcome before a particular intervention. And it's very good at helping us predict that particular outcome. But then we know that an intervention happens at a particular date. If we then just extrapolate forward that trend that we have then estimated from before and compare that with what actually happened when we had that intervention, we now suddenly have a bit of a benchmark to be able to create some type of way to compare what we did relative to this constructed counterfactual forecast.
And that's the use case that we're going to be talking through today. Now, assume that I'm a marketing manager and we've just put a lot of money towards a new marketing campaign. Obviously, one of the questions that I'm going to ask is, was it worth putting that money into it? Did it actually generate more sales? Did it generate more profit? Basically, the question being, should we run that campaign again? Causal impact is a package that could potentially allow us to answer that question. So let's look at it in action, shall we? And what we have here is Tableau Server, and Tableau Server is currently hooked up to R, and R is where we run that package. Just make it full screen here as well. Now, my data science team, here represented by Eric in today's demonstration, and we currently see the R package running, is telling me, first of all, to do step one, which is select the value that we want to calculate, which is currently set on profit, and that's great. I want to see whether or not we increase the profitability of our business by doing that marketing campaign. Now, the second step is to select the variables that are going to be used in the model. And the variables should be able to calculate or predict the value we want to calculate, but not be affected by the campaign. Now, as the first value, we have selected the Google Trends data, which is great. It's over multiple sectors and multiple businesses, and that's quite stable. It feels like a factor that I can use, and that's independent of my singular marketing campaign. Now, the second value I have is quantity of leads, or at least that's the one that's currently selected. Now, I know as a marketing manager that that's not something that I can use as an independent variable. It is actually the thing I actively wanted to impact. More leads would hopefully lead to more profit. Now, I'm going to look for another value that I could leverage. And in this case, that might actually be discount, because as that marketing manager, I know my business. And I know that the marketing campaign wasn't run on discounts and coupons, but it was run on customer use cases. Actually, our discounts stayed completely stable. Now, the moment I put in that value, as a business user, we can see Tableau Server finding that connection to R. R is going to do that counterfactual prediction and going to look for what the values would have been if we not have done that campaign. Now, as an end user, I see two things. I can see that we can trust this model. I have a green check mark. And the ROI, which is basically the difference between the prediction and our actual values, is about $426,000. Now, I can then take that value and bring it back into the organization and compare it to the investment that we made.
like a pretty good little insight there. I didn't know that when I was building that. So this was then that example where we're able to address that problem. Because it's not reasonable to really ask all of your business users to be trained in understanding these sort of statistical frameworks that you could apply to these types of problems. On the other hand, data scientists might be very well able to understand the nuances that you need to be conscious of when deploying something like this, but might not have access to that day-to-day form of information that the business users know surrounding the running of that marketing campaign, as Irvin was showing.
And that's what this session's about. By bringing together the world of the data scientists and the world of the business, they can together create more value. Now, how do we then propose to solve this? On the one hand, there's Tableau Server. It's the platform that you probably already use for data and insight collaboration in the organization. And we would just propose that by hooking that up to R or Python or MATLAB, whichever language you prefer, basically using one of our external service connections, can unlock that potential together.
So if you think about what these things would actually mean in practice, you would, in this case, be able to have, from your data science community, quicker development of analysis that is then informed by those contextual insights that your business users know about from their day-to-day running of the business. On the other hand, and this is, I think, a pretty big thing, really understanding how you can improve the return on investment and really the visibility of what it is that your data scientist community is doing, right? Because I think that there are so many data science teams doing amazing work in organizations, but I've also found that sometimes in speaking to different organizations, they sometimes talk about these ways in which you try to pull in certain members of the data science team into meetings with other types of users. You try to get them to communicate what it is that they're working with in a way that then can be fully scrutinized. But it's sometimes difficult maybe for them to be able to speak that same language, and for the people to really pay attention long enough for them to appreciate the work that data scientists do. And I think that this is maybe some sort of way how to address that.
So what is the end goal then? We want to see, we would propose, let me put it that way, that what Tableau has done for data ubiquity and data accessibility in an organization, moving that from that classical report factory to a more self-sufficient, iterative process, can be done for data science as well. It will require people to collaborate and bring in their specific areas of expertise. That's the word I was looking for, sorry about that. But that process can actually still be built, making sure that you create a world in which those two groups talk together and really start building value. And even though we see a few hands already popping up, which is actually great to see, we still know that a lot of organizations struggle with that. Although we do see a couple of our customers doing that already. And this is a great quote from Alex. He's a data scientist at Hallmark Cards, who's actually using Tableau to bring his value and the research that they do to more people. Tableau empowers the whole organization, and it brings advanced analytics into the hands of people who don't necessarily have an analyst or programmer skill set. And that's what we're talking about today. That's what we get if you have two clickers. Sorry.
So let's talk about how we bridge that gap then, Irvin.
Yes. So when we then define what we're talking about, is the original idea of Tableau. It's visual analytics. It's all about data access, or access to data discovery, being able to explore it at the speed of thought in a very visual way.
Whilst advanced analytics then is more about smart, automated, or different forms of predictive analytics, right? That allow you to push the boundaries of traditional forms of analysis. What we're really trying to impress upon you here today is how you can really take the best of both worlds here, where you present the results visually of the forms of advanced analysis that you're doing in your organization, to maybe use a bit of a bastardized term here, visual advanced analytics. I think that by bringing in the best of both worlds, you don't have to sacrifice that much, in my opinion.
So all solutions, when it comes to Tableau, and it's always how we've built the product, should adhere to 4 key characteristics. And the first of all is that it needs to be easy to use. End users, regardless of their skill level, should be able to interact and derive insight from that viz. It needs to be fast. It needs to make sure that the information that is required is there promptly. And the information that is portrayed needs to be powerful. It needs to provide insight and added value to the organization, as well, of course, being visual.
And I think that this is really a key point as well. I think that this process really has to be an iterative one where you have different types of scrutiny constantly happening between these different sets of users, so that you're constantly developing and changing these types of dashboards to fit the needs of what it is that's happening now, as opposed to last quarter, last year. I think that that entire process of continuous development is really, at its core, how you keep content like this relevant to your organization.
So what do we need? On the first hand, we have Tableau Desktop, and we allow that, or we use that to connect to our data, but also to our advanced analytical language. On the other hand, we have Tableau Server. It's where we're going to be sharing our insights, and we also use that to connect to that analytical language as well.
Which is, of course, that last thing that we need. So when we're looking at our external services connection, we're looking at RServe for R, we're looking at TabPy for Python, and we're looking at MATLAB Production Server when it comes to MATLAB. When it comes to the entire process of combining all of these things together, let's look at how these different things fit together in this way. So let's start with Tableau Desktop. You've connected into some data, and you want to start prototyping here a solution that makes use of that external services connection. So you have that external services environment available to it, and you make that connection between Tableau Desktop and you start developing your dashboards. At a certain point, you, of course, come to the point where you want to start sharing this. And that's, of course, where Tableau Server comes in. But in that moment of you publishing the content from Tableau Desktop to Tableau Server, you need to, of course, make that external services environment also available to Tableau Server. So when you make that connection, there are a number of ways that you can have that happen. You can, for instance, have that all happen on the same machine, or you can segment that out so that you have then different machines dedicated to, for instance, running Tableau Server on a dedicated node, and then having a single or multi-node deployment of these things running the external services environment.
The next step is then the end user. How are they going to consume that information? And the great thing about using Tableau Server as a means of bringing the value of data scientists to the wider organization is that they can access the information in the way that they've always done, using their phone with maybe our newly announced fully new mobile application, through their tablets, or through the web browser. They just log in to Tableau Server, find the dashboards that they're interested in, and they get the results coming out of it. They don't have to have a separate solution or connection to external services. Tableau Server is picking up that entire connection, meaning that as an end user, I might not even realize that I'm actually leveraging a dashboard that leverages that external service.
So how would we go about implementing this, Irvin?
Glad you asked. So the implementation framework, we just want to keep it simple for today, and it's basically surrounding 4 main steps. First one being discovery, and it's where the question is being asked and people want to find their insight. And the second one is where we're going to start prototyping and start thinking of models that we might use to answer the questions that are coming out of the business. Now, when we've settled upon a model, we have to make sure that that's then consumable to the wider organization. And that's where we have to start building that foundation, thinking of tips and tricks from guided analytics, making sure that we translate our work into a general understanding lingo. And then when we've done that, we can open it up and scale it out. And that first step is assessing the business question. And it's sort of what I did, or in the example that we're using, me asking Eric to see if he can build me a framework to answer that question, should we run that marketing campaign again? Now, in any organization, there's probably a few key users that really want to push the boat out when it comes to analysis, and they really want to get some more insight. Now, both from a business perspective and a data science perspective, those are usually the ones that are really interested in making this process work. Those are also the key people that you might want to appoint or see as the champions, and they need to be present from all aligned departments, whether it be marketing or finance or wherever the question's coming from, and of course from the data science team. And that can actually be the core and the new nucleus for your center of excellence. Center of excellence is actually important for all wider deployments of Tableau, but especially so when it comes to advanced analytics. It is there to develop and promote best practices when it comes to model creation, model development, but also model translation to the wider organization. It provides support to the entire organization and allows them to ask questions as they go along. And it basically just promotes that entire culture of advanced analytics.
So now that we have that initial question that we want to start addressing, let's talk through the workflow that we should be adopting when it comes to the development of this. So first, of course, as I've then received that question surrounding the marketing campaign, I want to understand what data that I have that is accessible for me to answer this. Now, I might have a preference for doing this within an external environment outside of Tableau. That's totally fine. But the key component is that I start building, at a certain point, my presentation or that visual layer through Tableau Desktop. Now, when it comes to using calculations within Tableau Desktop from such an external service environment, there are 4 key components to how those calculations work. And those are tied to the outcome types that we need to be conscious of for Tableau to be able to receive. So we have script real for all results that are returned within the real domain of numbers, script string for everything that's a string value, script int for everything that's an integer value, script boolean for any true/false. And the key components for us to have alongside this is to understand that this is then working as a table calculation. So in order to give you guys a bit of a sense for how this works in practice, let me jump over and show you how we might go about the development of this in this particular example. So within this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch here over to Tableau Desktop. And on my right-hand side, I have an R environment that's running R serve.
For those of you in the room, it's your left-hand side.
This is a very good point,
It's a good point, isn't it? Yeah.
There's that business user context.
That's why we do these things in pairs. It's just better.
My first step within this is to start connecting Tableau Desktop to that external environment. So I go here to Manage External Service Connection, and I define here how it is that I'm going to be connecting between RServe and Tableau. And within this case, I'm then going to check here with my R instance that I have running locally, and I'm then going to define the port 6311, which is the default one for RServe. I quickly test that connection. That's fine. And now I want to start building that counterfactual forecast. So my first step in this is to create a calculated field that I can use for building that forecast. Here, I'm going to call this my prototype field. And I'm going to start using that calculation type that I need in order to be able to build my connection to the R environment. Here I put in my R code, which I'm going to use for building that connection with causal impact. And I'm then going to import the different fields that I need in order to make this calculation work. Now, I know that this is all going a little bit fast right now, but I'd say that if you want to focus in on some of the deeper details surrounding how to build these calculations, I'd really recommend going to the hands-on training sessions, as well as some of the training materials that we have online for regards to how these calculations work. But just so that you see one happen here, what I'm going to now build out is my outcome variable, y, which I'm going to take in as my profit. I'm then going to pull in my quantity of leads. And I'm then going to pull in here my final step, my Google Trends data. I now see that this calculation is valid. Tableau is telling me that this is fine. It then also gives me that prompt that this is here that table calculation. And what I'm now going to do is I'm going to use this calculation so that it can be sent off to that external environment so that I can then see how this works. So here, it's being sent over to that R environment that's being set here to run in debug mode so that I can understand what it is that it's being sent and what's being returned. And I now see that I have my actual outcome variable as well as that prototype version of the calculation that I want to be having my users drive.
Now, in real life, you might want to, of course, have a few iterations of which models you might want to potentially use to answer that question. But the moment you settle on a model and really want to use that to answer the question, the next step then becomes, let's connect or publish that to server and establish that connection between Tableau Server and our external service connection. I'm pretty sure Eric has something to say about that.
I do indeed. Luckily, this is pretty easy to do. All that you have to do is here within this, define in the same way that we did for Tableau Desktop, where it is that your external service can be accessed from. So that's that first line for my host, external service, and the value localhost. So as though it was running on the same machine that Tableau Server was running on. And then I have the same thing with the port, which I would then just leave as a default in this case as 6311. At this point, I would then apply these changes, and they would then be deployed to my server so that I can now see these application changes being applied. If you're on a version prior to 2018.2, these commands exist in pretty much an equivalent form for tab admin.
Yeah, there's no difference there. And it's good to note that the values that you add here, so the port and the server, are exactly the same as Eric used during the connection, establishing the connection between desktop and R. So if they work for desktop, they will also work for server. Granted, of course, your server has access to that environment. Now, we've set up server, we've set up desktop, we've settled on a model, and now we have to make sure that it's valuable for all my business users. And that everything that Tableau does, the correct use of tooltips and titles and really guiding our end users through their organization is important. And it actually becomes more important when we're talking advanced analytics and a non-statistical trained user base. Making sure that people correctly and effectively consume the information without misinterpretation. We really have to tell them what they're looking at and what they should and shouldn't use. For as well, of course, allowing for interactivity and potentially using parameters to make sure that you only have to publish your model once and being able to be used by your end users in multiple use cases. Because once again, we sort of want to prevent ourselves recreating a report factory and really allowing for that iterative environment.
So let's go about building such a parameter that I think might be relevant for this type of analysis. So here I'm back within Tableau Desktop, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to try to prompt my users to maybe be a little bit more critical about the sort of decision criteria or decision rules that they're applying. So that, of course, lends itself for me to then ask, what is the p-value you want? And in this case, I'll then say, make this as a list. So I'll then just apply some pretty standard values with regard to how I think about these things. I'll do things at the 10% level, the 5% level, and at the 1% level. So then I can expose these things to my end users so that they can choose what sort of p-value that they want to make their decisions on.
But before I knew Eric, I wasn't even aware, or maybe aware, but I wasn't as part of the jargon and the lingo that Eric uses on a daily basis. So as an end user, I don't know what decision rules are, and I don't know what p-values are. So I have to think about what we can expose to our end users. Meaning that maybe we should not use words like p-value because they might just confuse people. Why don't we just create parameters that say, how sure do you need to be? Right? Let's just ask people how sure they need to be as a parameter and ask that as a question. Now, Tableau also actively asks me how I want to display these values. Am I actually going to tell end users to say the significance level of 10, 5, and 1%? Or am I going to say somewhat, very, and extremely. And it seems silly, but it is quite important, making sure that people have an understanding of what they're trying to do with the model and how mission critical it is without really understanding the nitty-gritty of this.
Great. So we now have that parameter value set, and we want to figure out then what other components can we look at with regards to these designs of the dashboard so that we can make it relevant for the needs of our organization. Now, within this case, I might want to, again, figure out maybe I don't even want to expose any sort of values surrounding how these decision rules should be applied. Maybe I just need to give certain visual cues so that my end users can understand what it is that they need to take actions on with regards to these decisions. So if I maybe have then a battery of diagnostic tests that look at whether or not certain things are significant, whether certain underlying assumptions seem to hold when we are looking at the application of this model, let's see how I could maybe go about applying that parameter in an example. So here I have, for instance, within this case, that check mark that I want to have scrutinized by my users. And here I see that I've just hard-coded in that value for 0.05. And now that I have that parameter, though, why not just change this value so that it's no longer being driven by something that's hard-coded, but just referencing that parameter that can then be changed by my end users. So I'll now hit apply. It'll then check that particular parameter value, and I then receive a visual cue to expose to my end users who can then understand whether or not they should be going along with this decision or not. So here, if I maybe change it to extremely, I can then start evaluating whether or not this is also significant at the 1% level if I'm within the data science team, or if I maybe need to ask them further questions about maybe we have a false positive here if I'm a business user.
And these parameters are extremely important because they don't only work in a calculation like this, which we're basically doing a Boolean statement, but they can also be used in the R code itself. The values we bring in, as Eric showed earlier in the causal impact calculation, in which we bring in the sum of profit and the sum of sales, those elements can actually be parameters as well, meaning that we can expose these values or interchange these values based off of use cases by our end users.
So now that we have prototyped that solution, we probably want to start sharing that with other people, don't we, Irvin?
That would be nice. We would argue that there's two types of scaling out across an organization, and let's touch upon both a little bit. The first one being just the iterative process across an organization, by which we mean that it's the number of people involved in creating these dashboards. You're going to have more people using these dashboards, which also potentially brings along more preferences. Some people like R, some people like Python, or just based off of a particular model that runs better in a particular platform. The other type, of course, is just the availability of these dashboards. Because we're going to potentially increase the sheer amount of people looking at these dashboards, we need to make sure that they don't time out, and these dashboards are always available to them.
So let's begin maybe by looking at that second question around how we make this total number of consumers of dashboards making use of external services more readily available and more performant. A key component in this is being able to balance the load that's being sent here to different environments. So if you think about Tableau Server, in this case, being connected into a single R environment, what we might want is to, in fact, place something like, in this case, HA proxy, so that then when you have a request being sent from Tableau Server, that doesn't have to be sent to a single R environment. It can actually be sent to multiple ones. Even if we're still only looking at one dashboard, you could actually have several different requests sent to different R environments so that you can then get the most speedy performance and responsiveness for those dashboards. Now, within this case, HA proxy, it's very simple, it's free, it's open source. All that you have to do is to just configure it so that it's listening for these different types of calls. And it's, of course, very useful in these instances for then scaling out our serve cases. So let's actually take a look at how that would work in in a situation where we had set up such a multi-node R environment. Here within this case, I have 3 VMs that are then hooked up to this load balancer that's then running HA proxy. And I see here that I then have a statistics report for looking at the traffic that's being sent between each of these different environments. I see that I have 3 R environments that are currently being run, all here available in green. And what I can now do is, in fact, start understanding maybe how I can connect Tableau Desktop by just connecting into that initial little load balancer as opposed to a single R instance. So I'm just going to look at then connecting in my environment here from Tableau Desktop. I'll change out from my local instance to then change my server to that IP address of that load balancer and just to port 80. I get a speedy response that this is now being handled. And now when I shift over, so that I now go to looking at my initial dashboard, I can see that this is now currently being run, and it's now being sent to my different R environments here so that these calculations can be run in different R environments all at the same time. Again, very simple, and I can then monitor as well whether or not I need to scale out my different R instances to make sure that I get the best performance for my end user community.
It actually increases the performance as well because we have our R instances available, and the dashboard actually has 3 worksheets that leverage code. So we can set all 3 at once and then have them rendered at the same time.
Now, the second component that we can start talking about with regards to helping the performance of those R instances is then making sure that the packages that we want are preloaded. So for instance, we might want to then define how our server instances should be spun up, if new ones should be added into that particular load balancer, but also just doing simple things like defining timeouts for calculations, making sure that it's not a single user who can be running an incredibly computationally intensive request to your cluster that could then be bringing it down the performance for lots of other users. Really simple best practices that just help ensure that you have the most consistent experience for as many users across the organization as possible.
So that's looking at more people accessing these dashboards. So what if I have more people with more preferences? Quickly the question comes up, can I use both R and Python? And currently in Tableau you can only connect to one external service. But there is an option. A huge European chemical organization, a big client of ours, is leveraging Flask. And it's actually a rerouter for requests to a specific environment. They have Flask set up based off of naming conventions to send these requests to the appropriate environment. Meaning that they have server on one hand and they want to use both Python and R at the same time. Now what they do is they still hook up Tableau to TabPy to funnel these requests into Flask. Based off of those naming conventions, Flask will send those requests to both Python and R. The results are coming back in Flask, back to Python, and then straight into Tableau Server. So it is definitely possible to use both of these platforms at the same time. Now today's session is not a session about governance. But it is something, of course, security is always something that we want to mention. One major advantage of being able to publish these dashboards that use an analytical language is the fact that by publishing it, we automatically adhere to the settings that you have set up on your server. You almost don't even have to worry about security because it's already been set up by your data security team. Tableau has that best in class when it comes to security and permissioning on Tableau Server, and we can leverage these values, the users and groups and projects, permissions, all the way down to row-level security and settings with these dashboards as we publish them up to Tableau Server. It's just good to think about a little bit, making sure that by publishing up these dashboards up to Tableau Server, they are iterative in a place where your end users are, and they're secure from the get-go. Of course, if you put them in the right projects, but that's something that you talk about, of course. Now the main step, just to make sure that this is all singular, is then thinking about continuous development. Up until this place, it's been a linear process, and we want to make sure that that's iterative and circular. Now we started off with those champions who create the center of excellence. And it is actually key in making sure that analytics and advanced analytics and new model creation continue going. So set up fun activities and foster them as you go along. Organize hackathons to think of new use cases and new models that can really help the organization out. Organize Makeover Mondays, basically specifically with the cause of seeing how you can translate the hard work of data scientists to be consumed by a wider organization. Set up a Tableau Doctor Hour, making sure that people can ask questions, sometimes about advanced analytics, sometimes about actually what they're seeing on the dashboard. Really making sure that people feel that there's a safety net in the organization that allows them to interact with these views. Now, we have some closing statements, obviously we do, but we also think that there might be some questions here and there. So let's stop for now and see if there's any questions. I see one at the front. Yeah. So the question was, how can you trust the model that has been brought up by your data scientists?
I would say that one really, really key component is by just engaging them with the discussion of how certain things were built. And it doesn't mean going into the nuts and bolts of everything, but to really start exposing your end users to what the model is doing in a sense, right? And it's understanding maybe that level of detail that your end user community is maybe comfortable with. And that might be different for different departments and different types of competencies. But one of the things that we have, for instance, in the dashboard shown here, is that because causal impact just outputs as well a much more verbose explanation for instance, that sort of underlying logic of what the model is doing, having something as simple as just returning more details surrounding what is happening under the hood can be one approach, but also maybe having a more verbose diagnostic component. I'm pulling in this data. It's an extract that was done at this time. These were the things that we use to inform our analysis. But I don't think that there's a silver bullet. I think it's usually a problem that is solved through discussion more than anything else.
Yeah, and the more you discuss and the more you engage both groups during the development of that dashboard, then you already have champions within both of those organizations. Right, so there's already business users involved in the creation of the model. There's already data scientists involved when they're interpreting, of course, the business context that they're looking at. That sort of should help with building that foundation, knowing that from each part of the organization, input has been delivered into the creation of that dashboard and that model. Hopefully that answers your question a little bit. Great. Another question right here. So can multiple people access the same dashboard on Tableau Server?
So the question for the rest of the room, can multiple people access the same dashboard on Tableau Server without HA proxy? And there, the answer is yes, but it is then dependent upon the performance of that external environment that you're connecting to. Like, if I only have a single threaded environment that's running there that Tableau Server is connecting to, then you're going to have a problem with people sitting in a queue if that is a very expensive query for it to run. If you have something that's multi-threaded, or you have something where you can have multiple processes running in general, that of course alleviates that problem without needing HA proxy.
We're also running a little bit out of time, perhaps, and R&Vis is coming up, and we really know that's actually a highlight for most people. So we'll stick around after the session to answer some more questions, but let's do the wrap-up now and do a summary of today's session.
Okay, so let's just recap. By scripting here with these different analytical languages into Tableau, what you're able to really do is to perform much more sophisticated statistical analysis than what you would have done otherwise. You're also able to allow end users to really ask their own questions and, in a way, enable self-service for different types of activities surrounding data science, right? But more importantly, it's also giving you a way how to visually communicate the results of quite complex analysis. Now, there might be some of you sitting here thinking, now this sounds great, but will my business users ever really understand what it is that my data scientists are doing, my team as a data scientist are doing? I'd say that here, you don't have to necessarily see this as such a new problem, right? Because maybe we would have been having a similar discussion with database administrators about, can people really have access to all this form of data? Will they know what to do with it? I think overall, and I think that this is the approach adopted by organizations that I've seen that's done this successfully, it's you can't let really the perfect be the enemy of the good here. You're never going to have all your business users really understand maybe all of those nuances and all of the things that you might need to really critique the validity of these claims, but they should still be part of the discussion, both from the standpoint of that you engage them with different types of questions that they might not even be conscious of being important, but also the fact that they offer really valuable insights at times for how we develop these models.
Talking about development, for every step you do, of course, take into account those 4 key characteristics we want that solution to adhere to. Make sure that your solution, whatever it is easy to use, fast in its responsiveness, powerful in its insight, and of course visual, making sure that your end user really can understand it. Use that framework by really tackling those champions during the discovery phase. Start prototyping with all users and start finding those models that you can that you want to build out. You build that out by building a foundation, by not just making sure the model is valid, but it's also consumable by the wider organization, and that will allow you to scale it out and push it onto server. As I already said, get your champions involved. They're crucial in making sure that the continuous development of these models keeps going, and that actually creates that iterative environment and promotes feedback and just an overall better usage of these analytical languages. In conclusion, just get out there, start unlocking those opportunities, start looking at the possibilities. In general, we feel you got this now. It's cute, isn't it? Yeah. Thank you so much. There's some other sessions. Tableau plus Python equals love. There's a hands-on R session as well, embedded and data science. If you can, please fill out the survey as well. We do truly read all of these results. Let us know. Thank you.
Question, you guys.
Yes.